I think it's about time that we actually seriously discuss the darshanas or the philosophical schools of India, which I'm hoping to at least introduce you to in this short video. Um, Darshana is what we call the philosophical schools of India, especially of classical India. Um, what exactly is Darshana and why is that term even used in the first place? Well, it actually means perspective or viewpoint. So instead of using the word philosophy, the love of wisdom, or using the word like religion, which tends to be a little heavy, the word darshana simply means how we see, how we view something. It actually has the roots from the word drishti, which means standpoint or position. So again, darshana is actually one's position, one's viewpoint, how one sees the world, their world view, you can say. The S you see at top over there is pronounced as an SH. So it is actually a darshana, not a darsana. The same thing can be seen in Siva, which is actually pronounced Shiva, and Ganesha, which is actually pronounced Ganesha because of the SH in the pronunciation of it. Now, in India, a lot of times people would actually just cut off the A at the back and just say it as darshan. Now, that is a it's influenced by Hindi. In Sanskrit, you would actually technically still pronounce the A in the back, but this is highly debatable, and this is not what the video is about. So it's really up to you if you would like to say it as darshana and retain the A at the back, or say darshan, like how most North Indian speakers do. That's completely up to you. For the purpose of this video, because I'm not from India and I don't speak Hindi, I'd be speaking it as Darshana, Ganesha, and Shiva, not as Darshan, Ganesh, Shiv, and so forth, where the A is eaten at the back. So when do people do darshana? When do people view? Well, if one would go to the temple, you would then view the deity, and the deity would then look back at you, would then do darshan back on you. So there's a two-way exchange of this looking and being looked. Likewise is the case when you actually meet a holy person. You then take in their darshan, you then take in their view, and you this seeing is already understood in use of language as darshana itself. So darshana is perspective and to see, and that is why I symbolize it with an eye, because it's all about how you see the world. But at the same time, I kind of like to give a little modern twist to it, and I say that darshana is more like glasses, because the thing with eyes is that it's kind of fixed and you have it all the time. But glasses can be interchangeable, and that's actually what darshanas are. Darshanas can be changed. You can have one darshana growing up, you can have another one later, and that's actually the flexibility of the whole darshana concept in the first place. And that's why I kind of looked at it more as putting on glasses. Which darshana, which perspective are we going to look at something? Which perspective are we going to use? I think it's really important in the beginning to look at the definitions of the words that we're going to be using. Philosophy, the love of wisdom, right? Philosophy, what we know about it at least, is very influenced by the Greeks. We think of philosophy as thinking about something very heavily, being very pensive, being lost in thought, and contemplating on to be or not to be. In a way, Darshana is like that, but Darshana is actually more applicative. Darshana, yes, looks at how the world is, looks at how we think of the world, looks at who we are, looks at what our purpose is, but it also looks at what to do with it. Rituals to be done, lifestyles to be adopted. What our daily lifestyle should then be conducive to what we believe in. The next word we have is dharma. Now, dharma can mean a lot of things. Um, it is pretty much overused in the Indian context, and dharma itself has the root from dri, which means to hold, to uphold, to hold something like a pillar. So dharma is actually the pillars that actually hold everything up. what exactly is dharma? Now, from a Hindu context, dharma is usually one's morality, one's duty, to uphold the social balance. From a Buddhist perspective, dharma is actually more like things which hold the universe in place. The elements, the atoms, that's all the dharmas that hold everything together. So we're going to encounter the word dharma and be wary that we're going to actually look at different interpretations and different meanings of what dharma is. In short, dharma is what holds everything together. It can be your actions, it can also be the atoms, the cells, and everything else. So be prepared for a very, very broad understanding of what dharma is. The next word that we definitely are about to encounter is religion. Now, one thing to note is that the darshanas is actually not religion. Darshana is one's perspective, one's viewpoint. Religion tends to be a little bit more, it involves more commitment. Let's just say that. Religion, you then have to believe, you then have to be baptized or be initiated, you then have to accept a doctrine, you then have to believe in it, you then have to do rituals based on it. Meanwhile, a darshana is actually just how you see the world and how you see yourself in it. It's a little bit more simple, but it's far more inclusive. Now, your religion can be influenced by what darshana you have, for sure. And your religion will also have its own darshana, its own viewpoint. But it's really important not to mix the two things together. Religion is something you accept, religion is something you then fully dedicate yourself to. Meanwhile, a darshana is simply what you put on, how you see the world, how you want to view the world around you. Let's take a better understanding of what philosophy or darshana is, especially in comparison with religion. Let's try to answer this question together. Should we accept a high paying job that goes against our values? Well, in the world of darshana, in the world of philosophy, we then can choose what perspective we want, unlike religion, of course. If we want to go with what Aristotle goes by, the darshana of Aristotle, then choose a job that is in line with our values so that we are happy. So we have to pick a job that's in line with our values. But if you want to use the darshana or the philosophy of John Stuart Mill, then the important thing is to be paid so that the money can be used for happy life. So which one's more important? The work itself that goes with your values or the money that you make from work that you can use to your own liking? This exactly is how philosophy or darshana works. It's really a matter of perspective, which is why, again, back to the glasses analogy, I might be biased because I've been wearing glasses all my life, but hey, I think it works. Um, so when you're looking at the darshanas, don't think of it as like looking at different religions or looking at different denominations. Think of it like you're going to the optics store and you're buying glasses. You have you have a nicer frame, you have a yellow frame, you have a tinted lens, and so forth. It's just a matter of choice. It's something that you can kind of pick and choose and wear as you want. So the darshan is actually quite flexible. They're not something that you have to agree with all your throughout your entire life. Your parents, your father can have a different darshana, your mom can have a different darshana, you can have a different darshana to your sisters, to your brothers, to your teachers. And that's completely okay. Again, it's not about religious affiliation, it's about how you see the world. And how you see the world is going to change, is influenced by what happens in your life and the people you meet and what you read. Um, so we're going to look at the different darshanas that exist back in classical Indian periods, and we're going to really see what each of them really taught of the world. The first one we'll be covering is Nyaya, or the sources of knowledge. So the school of Nyaya, the tradition of Nyaya, really looks into what exactly is knowledge, what is knowing, where do we know things from. For example, right now you're listening to me, but am I credible? Is going to, a video to learn about classical Indian philosophy a good way to do it? Well, those are the things that Nyaya debate about. Vaisheshika, on the other hand, looks at the atoms and looks at differentiation in the level of the atoms. So I and you might be pretty alike. We're both humans, but then what makes me me and what makes you you? according to the Vaisheshika schools, we have to look into the atoms, into that molecular level to see exactly how one thing differentiates from another. We'll be looking into that when we study their philosophy. Sankhya looks into the duality of Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha is everything that is spirit, Prakriti is matter. Karma Mimamsa looks at the rituals, the yagya rituals that is there in the Veda, and how this is then really important to then guarantee liberation or to then lead a proper life. Dharma, according to the Mimamsakas, is the conduct of ritual. Vedanta, on the other hand, speaks about more esoteric and supernatural things like God and our connection with God, along with the world and us, and how all of these three things connect. In case you haven't noticed, the other schools didn't really mention or talk much about God. Well, Vedanta is one of those schools that actually go deeper into what God is and what is God's relationship with us. Yoga, yeah, when people hear yoga, people kind of think of, the acrobatics or the fitness regime in the gym. Well, the yoga that we're going to be speaking of here, the yoga philosophy, is actually more about mind control and how exactly the mind is to be tamed, how exactly the mind is to be kept um restricted, in fact, in order to then control our body and then obviously pick an outcome. These six together, the Sad Darshanas or the six Darshanas, is what we call the Āstika school, or the school that accepts the Veda. What exactly is the Veda? The Veda is actually written in Sanskrit, which is actually coming from Samskrita, perfectly formed. So those who believe in the Vedas believe that the mantras, the sound that is in the Vedas, are pure, they are uncontaminated, and they are received through seers from the universe itself. Now, the Veda, when we think of sacred books, we think of like a book, but the thing about the Veda is that it's actually shabda or sound. So it's actually received as mantras. It's actually received more as as verbal, as something that is to be heard, shruti, right? To be heard, and it's not really something that is to be read with like chapters or plot twists. No, it's actually more of a collection of hymns and a collection of sounds which are considered to be perfection and from the universe itself. Now, these Vedas, the Vedic mantras, were then used in courts, were then used officially by the empires of the Aryans, in especially at that time in North India. So you then would have these Āstika schools which follow the Veda, and the Veda is then is then considered official and is has a stamp of approval by the kingdom, and therefore it is what's considered the norm. It's what's considered orthodox. Meanwhile, you then have philosophical schools, darshanas, which do not agree with the Vedas or do not necessarily consider it to be the perfection of all sounds. These are the Nāstika schools. Notice the A is with a roof on Āstika and Nāstika, so it's actually pronounced as a double A. I'm not trying to be pretentious, I'm just trying to tell you how it's actually pronounced. So, Nāstika schools, they do not necessarily accept the Vedas, and these schools that we'll be covering would be Buddhism, which discusses about how to relieve suffering or how suffering is then to be understood or to be seen, like the Darshana towards suffering and the causes of suffering. Look at Jain or Jaina. The Jain school looks at how exactly one is to be non-violent. So how should one avoid violence? The Jains, they kind of look like the Buddhist, especially if you see them, like the bald, mainly men, sometimes with just white cloth or sometimes even fully naked. If you see images of the Jain Tirthankaras or the Jain holy men, then there's not much of a difference there in iconography from the Buddha. Um, so a lot of people, especially out of India, might be quite confused about the Jains. They are predominantly still just in India or among Indian diaspora communities, and they're not as international as Buddhism or Hinduism. But we'll understand and try to get to know them better later. And then you have the Lokayata Lokayata school is all about enjoying the world, the hedonist or the materialist school, which again we'll look into. But before we go there, let's try to understand the context of the Āstika and the Nāstika schools. Now, a lot of them were in South Asia. Almost all of them were in South Asia. And before borders and countries existed, yes, this entire region was Afghanistan all the way to probably modern day Bangladesh. And this entire South Asia region is where these schools predominate. However, in the early stages, a lot of them were focused in northwest India, around Punjab, Pakistan, Afghanistan today. So that was actually the cradle of the entire early civilizations, by the Sindhu River. And it is this Indus Valley area where a lot of the Āstika and Nāstika schools actually play about. Their interactions are mainly there. But then later, obviously, it spread towards the east into the river Ganges and so forth. But we'll look into the geography a bit later. But what's important to understand is that in this area, we have three kinds of lifestyles or three kinds of groups. You have the householders. The householders, they marry, they have a family, and they worship with the domestic fire, which we'll talk about later, but it's basically sacrifices and worship that was done in homes. And it is a whole lifestyle, lives all surrounding the idea of having a household, having a family, having a partner, having children. Meanwhile, the second lifestyle group are the mendicants or the ascetics. These are hermits, sages, who then would live in isolation in forest. They would not have a family, they would not be a part of mainstream society. They do not live in cities and towns and houses, but instead they isolate themselves in forests. A very contrasting lifestyle to the householders. And the third lifestyle group is the kings, the bourgeoisies, the elites. They are the ones that are rich. They are the ones that own land, own empires, have a lot of gold and food. And they would obviously have a very different darshana or perspective of life. So it's really important to keep in mind when we talk about these darshanas, the three main lifestyle groups. You have people who are householders living in cities and civilizations and townships. You have ascetics, hermits, who then would live in isolation in the forest. And you have kings, empires, landlords, who then would live amongst people in towns, but would obviously be more wealthy than the rest. It's important to keep in mind these three different lifestyle groups and the context of where these Āstika and Nāstika schools are to then properly understand who they were arguing and who were they trying to win, who were basically the population that they were speaking to. Now, as we have understood better the context of where these darshanas were, let's try to go a little deeper and try to really understand the difference between Western and Eastern philosophy. Obviously, here, when we talk of Western philosophy, we're mainly talking of the Greeks, and when we're talking about the Eastern philosophy, we're hyper focusing on Indian classical philosophy, as that is what is relevant in the study of darshanas. Now we have the branches of philosophy. We have the metaphysics, which is investigating the ultimate nature of reality. So it's to asking questions like, is the world real? Does God exist? We have epistemology, which asks, how do we know? What are the sources of knowledge? And we have ethics, which discusses obviously are moral principles universal, what is good, what is bad, and so forth. Meanwhile, the darshanas are actually more of a holistic teaching. They are trying to give us perspectives of how we can actually impact every part of our lives. So we're going to be talking about in the darshanas what is one's duty, dharma, what is one's source of wealth, artha, what is then desire and how should one deal with desire or enjoy desire, kama, and of course, what is liberation, moksha. So the Darshana schools actually all discuss, at least most of them discuss about moksha. How exactly is one to be liberated from this world? Not only understanding how the world is and how one should live in the world, but also how should one renounce the world or how will one leave the world? This is one thing that actually differentiates darshanas from Western philosophy. The other difference is the commentarial traditions. So what happens is in Western philosophies, you have one particular figure associated with their idea. So we have Plato, Aristotle, and so forth, and then we have ideas from them. However, in the case of schools, they tend to be there's many people behind a tradition. So when we're looking at, for example, the school of Nyaya, we're not only looking at one person like Gautama, or he's also known as Akshapada, but we're also looking at all these different people who then contribute to the tradition. And how do they contribute to the tradition? Well, they write text. So, for example, here we have the Nyaya Sutras written by the first founder, you can say, or the first personality associated with Nyaya. You have Gautama, also known as Akshapada. But then afterwards, you then have Vatsyayana writing his own Vatsyayana Bhashya based on the Nyaya Sutra. And then you have Udyotakara writing the Bhashya on the Vatsyayana Bhashya, which discusses the Nyaya Sutra. And then the fourth layer, you have the Nyaya Tatparyatika, written by Vachaspati Mishra, who then discusses and elaborates on the previous three, and so forth. So you have this commentarial traditions where you have new books or new discussions, new debates being made, commenting and adding theories and ideas and arguments, either defending or changing the one before. So it's a very dynamic tradition of writing commentaries. It's not that the founder says this thing and then that is going to hold on the entire time. Most of the times, the original instigator or the original founder of the school will have founding principles, and those generally stay. But then you have a variety of different understandings of what that actually means and what that implies. And what's really interesting is that these Darshana schools were actually in interaction and communication with one another. So when they go into debates and when they discuss and have these discussions, they then learn from one another too. Now, these learnings are not necessarily ignored, but these learnings are then made to then fortify or to make their own arguments better. So if they hear something from an opponent school that they like, they might as well adapt it and write it again in their new text. So you have these commentarial traditions updating the arguments, updating the darshana, the standpoint of the schools itself. They're not static, but they keep changing with a variety of different philosophers, of different personalities, not attributed to one. And obviously, they do change in time. So there is phases of the darshana schools. Again, when we're talking of the darshanas, we're talking of schools, which involves a lot of people. This is very different with Western philosophy, which usually is based on a person. Philosophy of Plato, philosophy of Aristotle. But then when we're talking of the philosophy of Nyaya, it includes Gautama, Vatsyayana, Udyotakara, Vachaspati Mishra, Udhayana, Vardhamana, Padmanabha Mishra, and Shankara Mishra, and so forth, and many, many more. So when we're talking of a school, we're actually talking about a lot of different thinkers, not just one, and these thinkers update arguments and text based of what they learn from debates and what they learn from reading off each other. Lastly, what actually happens with the darshanas is that they do something known as anvikshiki, or critical examination of data provided by perception and scripture. So they're going to investigate further scripture. They're going to look deeper into if scripture, religious scripture, is actually applicable or not, or how can it be interpreted. So it's not just a tradition of interpreting scripture, but it's also a study of completely understanding how scripture works, how religious doctrine works. So it's applying philosophy directly to religion. Now, in Western philosophy, we also have religious philosophers, but most of the time they're actually trying to defend the church or defend the Bible. But then in the case of Indian philosophy, classical Indian philosophy, they're not necessarily defending the Veda, but they can also be against it, depending on their viewpoint or depending on their argument. Or they can actually be commenting on the Veda, giving an apologetic or giving an argument to defend the Veda even further. So it kind of depends on how the school is and how and which stance they want to take, but they are then there to debate on scripture, to debate on religion. We have a very famous Hindu sage known as Krishna Dvaipayana Vedavyas, in short Vyasa. And Vyasa actually is the sage that is known to be one of the founders of the Darshana school of Vedanta. So it's really interesting how Veda Vyasa is said to compile the Vedas and is said to actually be the person attributed with the compilation of sacred scripture, but at the same time also forms his own darshana, his own perspective, which goes to show that religion is actually just perspectives, or a better word for it would probably be interpretations. Religion is not one thing, religion is just a collection of various different interpretations. All right. Thank you so much for joining me through and understanding a little bit more about what Darshana is. Again, it's really important in this video that we clarify that Darshana is philosophy, but there is a difference between Western philosophy and Indian or Eastern philosophy. These are the sources that I used in making this class. And there is a book that I'd like to recommend for further reading. If anyone is interested in reading more about Indian philosophy and its introduction, this is a fairly recent book, An Introduction to Indian Philosophy by Bina Gupta. It's one of the books I've kind of used also in making these classes, and it's one that you can read in your spare time if you're interested in delving deeper. All right, I'm Dr. Ravinjay. Thank you so much for joining me in this class and hope to see you again soon.